before we go on, I thought I'd just say a few words about Justice Connect, because if you don't know about Justice Connect by now, you should. Because in my opinion, they are an organisation about whom there should be a kind of kick-ass TV show. They are like this sort of superheroes of law. They have kind of night vision, and they find the problem areas in the legal system that are kind of on the very edge, where there are really unmet legal needs, and they get a bunch of really awesome lawyers who, for free, work on those problems, and they just sick the lawyers onto the problems. And often those cases do become really big test cases, and you see them in the media, and they do change, in really significant ways, kind of the world. Now, what else was I going to say? The 30%. They rely on private donations and philanthropy and so on for 30% of their profit. So they really are the good guys of law, and they depend on, cats like you guys to support them. There are, on your seats tonight, there'll be just some information about a kind of pamphlet about them. Please take a look at it. You can donate and do all sorts of helpful things for them. And when they do that kind of work, what they're doing is they're shedding light on problems that exist where there are real inequities in society, and kind of complexities that need to be kind of ironed out. And in that sense, essentially, go with me here, they are looking at ridiculous laws, and they are kind of trying to address how society deals with inequities in that really kind of practical way. So let's remember that while we talk about a range of things tonight, from the sublime to the entirely ridiculous. Now, it is a big pleasure to sit up here with one of Australia's finest legal minds, and it's also lovely to have Julian with us today. Because this event sold out in about a nanosecond, I'm just going to presume that you guys don't need too much intro from me, but for those aliens who've been beamed in for the evening, welcome. This is Julian Burnside, sitting next to me, who is, I'm going to list the things it says on his website: barrister, human rights advocate, author, and I'm going to add hero of our times. This is Julian. And this is Charlie Pickering, comedian, star of the project, or ex-star of the project, star of the Weekly very much, professional...
Hero of our times.
Hero of our times, professional scallywag, and also what I was alluding to before, a law graduate, Charlie.
Yeah, narrowly.
Yes. Yes.
I did 1 week of articles.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
No, round of applause for Charlie.
I did. Thank you.
And my name's Lorin Clarke. I have a background in law, if you squint, and also radio and writing, and it is a great pleasure to be here this evening. Now, we were talking back there about the fact that there are 2 sources of law. This is something we remember, isn't it? 2 sources of law in terms of how laws are made. There's the common law, which is the kind of the courts, and the legislation, which is parliamentarians enacting the will of the people, is the pleasant way of thinking about what happens there. And my first question to you, Julian, is when those laws are being made by the people who make them, do you think they are always thinking about those laws and their practical implication?
Okay, talking about the common law, which is made by judges, yes, they do. They really do think very hard. You mightn't like the way they think, but they think very carefully about it. Parliamentarians, not so much. Parliamentarians, in fact, most of the really ridiculous laws we will talk about tonight are laws made by parliaments, either here or in other countries. But it's possible for 2 reasons. The first of them is that the parliamentarians often do not actually turn their mind to what it is that they're enacting. And one of the finest examples is from the early 19th century in England, when there was they were installing a lot of waterworks right across the country, and in conjunction with the canal works and so on. And the detailed local planning was always hived off to the town clerk of the relevant area, because they knew where property boundaries were and all the local details. Now, one town clerk was given the job of preparing the relevant provisions that would go in the statute that would deal with all of the waterwork legislation that needed to be passed. This town clerk was unhappily married, and at that time, in the early 19th century, divorce wasn't possible. A statute for divorce hadn't been made, and so the only way you could get divorced was to have a private act of parliament, which was only available to people who are rich or well connected. So anyway, in amongst all the draft provisions that he prepared for, drainage and filter beds and this and that, appears the innocent little sentence, "The town clerk's marriage is hereby dissolved." And it made it through every stage of Parliament and got the royal assent. And now people wonder, well, does that apply to every town clerk in that area? And I think the dominant view is, no, only that particular town clerk.
Surely they should be given the choice.
Well, no, because of course when judges have to decide questions like this, they try and see what Parliament must have intended, which in itself is kind of ridiculous, because Parliament didn't intend anything. Everyone was asleep by the time the thing came up. So I think that's probably one of the most ridiculous laws I can think of offhand.
It's excellent. One of the sources of the more ludicrous laws, you just have to do a Google search, Charlie, is the States. You're familiar with some of the more insane, gun laws, subheading 1.
Yeah.
Tell us about some of your thinking on that.
Well, the great thing to understand about America is it's often referred to as the incubator of democracy. And that is largely because there are 50 states, each with their own legislatures, where any crackpot can get elected and start passing laws. Not just at a federal level as we're seeing now, but in the nitty-gritty. And what I love is I think you can get a sense of the personalities of different states just by their unique laws that you come across. Before I get to guns, if I can mention one of my favourites.
Please.
Which is from Missouri. And it's a law that states that if a bull or a ram over the age of 1 runs rampant for more than 3 days, any person may castrate the animal without assuming liability for damage. However, 3 town residents must attest in writing that the animal was on the loose, and the owner must not respond. Right now, to me, this paints a picture of Missouri that suggests it had a simultaneous problem of a lot of bulls on the loose, and also a lot of people castrating said bulls willy-nilly in an unregulated fashion.
I'm not sure willy-nilly is what.
No, that's What I particularly like is the level of administration now required, that you need affidavits from multiple townspeople. I can imagine one person frustrated with a bull, desperately wanting to castrate it, door knocking, going, "Have you seen that bull? Can you sign this? I want to whip off the nads." Some say this strikes a great balance between personal property and public safety. I say it bogs down too much castration in unnecessary red tape.
A sentence you've not said before.
No, I don't think so. But gun laws to me are utterly fascinating because they're so foreign for us. The idea of a right to bear arms is so different to anything that we could understand. But my favourite portion of gun laws is where liberty just clearly intersects with public safety in a way that is incongruent. There are 3 states where the blind can get a licence to hunt with a firearm. They are Texas, Michigan, and Iowa. Now, in Texas, they have to be accompanied by someone, which is pretty reasonable for Texas.
Or a guide dog can do
or a
double service.
Guide dog, yeah, serves a dual purpose.
Yes.
In Michigan, they can hunt alone, which is wonderful. Like, because obviously part of this I'm innately predisposed to want anyone living with a disability to live their life to the full. And I cannot think of any greater achievement off the top of my head than a blind person making it to the forest alone, hunting alone, successfully killing something.
And driving home.
That's right. But you've raised the most interesting point. It was like Iowa adopted these laws very late in the piece. It was in 2013. And yeah. So it was a situation that needed to be remedied, that blind people were not hunting in Iowa. And the argument publicly came down to the disagreement over what you can and cannot get a licence for when you are blind. And it was pointed out that blind people cannot get a driver's licence and drive. The NRA successfully argued that we're not talking about a licence, we're talking about a right enshrined in the Constitution. And to deny that right from someone purely because of a disability is an extreme level of discrimination. And therefore, they successfully passed the law that a hunting licence applies differently to a driver's licence, and the blind can now, thankfully, hunt in Iowa.
Which shows how courts can misunderstand these things. The Second Amendment, which enshrines the right to bear arms, is a direct reflection of the UK Bill of Rights of 1689, which has a provision which says that for their protection, Protestants have the right to bear arms. Now, of course, that was all the whole Jacobean thing, but the Americans just picked it up and stripped out the religious discrimination and said everyone has the right to bear arms. Mad.
There are so many kind of dramatic sort of ironies that can be hilarious, but can also be quite devastating, can't they? And the more you think about the silly examples, the more light it casts on, there was an example you were mentioning before of somebody who, there's a law that if you, I don't know if it's still a law, but if you touch, if you touch a fence? An
electric fence.
Yeah. That kills you.
It kills you. You're guilty of an offence.
You're instantly fined $200.
And of course, attempted suicide used to be a hanging offence.
So
a number of people would turn themselves in.
Yeah. But picking up on your point,
yeah.
I like the fact that until '96, with the Port Arthur massacre in Tasmania, it was lawful to own an AK-47, but not lawful to be gay. Now that's really screwy.
Mm. And you work now, of course, we all know, in lots of different areas which are real human rights, where there are real human rights concerns because of things like this. Do you think, is it, it's kind of, there are things like the waterworks example that you used earlier, where obviously people weren't paying attention. The guy's put his marriage, divorced without anybody noticing. But there are, with asylum seeker laws, for instance, there is a nation full of people who are bearing witness to this, and yet yet there are kind of legal fictions like, a kind of statelessness and, excise zones and so on, which I suppose Australia is not afraid to go there because of terra nullius, which is the very first white settler legal fiction. What is it about, to bring a serious question here, but what is it about the law that can kind of see two truths to exist, and yet they're kind of, they operate together? And people don't seem to...
I actually think that when you get ridiculous laws like, things to do with asylum seekers and begging as a crime and, gender dysphoria can't be corrected except with an order of the family court, things like that. It's almost always because the people whose interests are at stake are either vulnerable or powerless, and the state can pretty much ignore the harm that it inflicts on them, because it doesn't have to think about them. It's one of the areas where democracy, I think, really fails us. For example, in relation to gender dysphoria, there are people, not very many of them, but there are some, who have been assigned one sex when they're born and actually believe that they belong to the opposite sex. Because of a High Court decision called Marion's case, the High Court held that only the state has the power to order or to authorise a sex reassignment. And so even though the child may believe that he or she belongs to the opposite sex, and even though the child's parents agree to have a sex reassignment, they cannot get it unless they get an order from the family court, and that's expensive. And for many people, it's not possible.
Is that a product of that's a product of a judicial decision at a high court?
It is, but it could be very easily be overcome by a bit of sensible legislation if the Parliament thought those people matter enough.
And that's the other side of what you were saying about so often the victims of ridiculous laws are vulnerable and powerless and not in a position to draw attention to their plight or remedy the situation themselves. The other side of the coin is there is someone who stands to benefit politically from legislating in the ludicrous direction.
Ludicrosity.
So you would argue that there is a political gain to marginalise the trans community because there's a certain number of voters that don't like trans people for who they are and are therefore happy to see them punished by the law. Yeah,
there's either political gain for them or the flip side, no political advantage in swinging in for that marginalised group. What
about domestic violence, Julian? Because it just going on from that comment, often the courts are criticised in those cases for all sorts of presumptions that are made by judges in comments and so on that get reported in the paper. And they do seem to be like that. Once you've read a few of those, it's very easy to see a bit of a narrative forming there that's separate from the legislative agenda, or well, ostensibly.
I don't know how the parliamentarians get away with it. We've got some very, very harsh laws directed against terrorist offences, and curiously, the largest death toll from a terrorist act in Australia was in 1854 at the Eureka Stockade. Since then, I think there may be, on average, one death from a terrorist act every couple of years, whereas women die in domestic violence episodes, roughly, 3 women every fortnight die in domestic violence, and yet the law is not nearly as stringent in relation to domestic violence as it is in relation to terrorism, which is truly bizarre. And we honour the memory of the Eureka Stockade every December. And of course the other notorious terrorist in Australian history was Ned Kelly. And we think he's pretty cool. So
well, he had a gimmick. Well, it helped.
Well, yeah, that tin hat.
He had armour. That was cool.
He didn't like the cops either. That was pretty cool of him.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but what about... So where does it have to start then? In order for ridiculous laws to not be a central part of the way our country works, which it sort of seems sometimes is the case, where does the change need to start? If people are feeling so disenfranchised that which I think you can kind of suggest they might be, rallying doesn't feel like it's, and particularly when you get arrested every time you turn up to something. Where does the change need to happen?
Parliamentarians have to think and they have to care.
Oh, that's a shame.
Yeah, I know.
That's not a solution at all, Julie.
Think about parliamentarians who have to think. In Idaho, they passed a law which, for the convenience of engineers, said that the value of pi is 3. I think it was widely ignored.
That solves that then.
Yeah.
But But for politicians to think and care, we've all met politicians. There might even be a politician or two in this room. Don't call them out. But it has to be in their self-interest to think and care.
Yes. And I don't know how you make it in their self-interest, except by calling them out, perhaps, by holding them to account.
Where do you find hope then for change? Do you find hope, Julian? Please tell me you find hope.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. If I didn't find hope, I'd
You'd go
commit
and
the
get yourself
capital
arrested.
offence of killing myself.
I wonder if there is a greater opportunity for explanation of principles away from where the political debate finds itself, which is always so binary, and you're stuck often in the binary political debate on asylum seekers.
That's right.
Do you mean media?
Within the media, which is the
Murdoch.
world.
I mean, breaking through the Murdoch membrane is a problem.
Yeah.
Because if you don't get your voice heard there, it will not be heard by many people. And that's not, if fewer than 50% of the public are interested in what you say, the politicians won't be the least bit interested because they're after the majority. Yeah. Well, that was a ridiculous note, wasn't it?
I must say, I emailed you earlier in the week and I said, do you have any ridiculous laws that you know about? Thinking you might have a couple. And you emailed me back the most extraordinary list of them. Is it a little bit of a nerdy obsession of yours, dare I suggest?
Ridiculous laws?
Yeah.
No. I'd never even thought about them very much.
Really? Okay, so here are some that he gave me. Is it still the case, by the way, that in the Gold Coast it's illegal for women to wear a bikini whose material exceeds 6 square inches? Or is that no longer the case?
It may no longer be the case. I didn't check it carefully.
Because
I'm not that nerdy.
Well, because that seems like maybe one where all of the women were absent from the decision making. Seems a little bit unusual.
Are you sure that wasn't just a campaign policy of Warwick Capper when he ran for mayor of the Gold Coast?
Was it you who I heard saying once that if that there was a case to be made for the fact that the nuns in The Sound of Music are people smugglers?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, clearly they are. The Von
Changes
Trapp
the
family were
musical a
certainly
little bit.
refugees and the nuns were people smugglers.
I'm going to watch that again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Makes it so much more interesting. Operation Edelweiss.
Yes.
Oh.
But what I like is that it's exactly the movie that John Howard would have gone to when he was growing up.
Yeah. But it's remarkable. So where is that disconnect? Because talking about our stance on refugee policy now and the way the laws don't make sense. I recently watched a documentary on the Roosevelts. It was a Ken Burns documentary. And there was a piece of footage I'd never seen before, which was Eleanor Roosevelt when she spoke in favour of and achieved the passing of the United Nations Agreement on the Rights of the Refugee post-World War II. And to my knowledge, it's the only standing ovation in the history of the United Nations. Australia, as a country, was heavily involved in arguing for what the rights of refugees should be. And it was a moment of genuine pride for me as an Australian, but also as a human being, to watch people get together and do you know what? There are just some people whose situation is so desperate that their legal status should be a certain way. And I feel like that story, or stories like that, need to be told about how we should feel strong when we agree what it is to be human, not when we agree what it is to be different.
Well, the event you're talking about was the 10th of December 1948, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was entered into force by the General Assembly of the UN, which was presided over by Doc Evatt, by the way, an Australian. And Australia, despite then having a population of 4.5 million or 5 million people, a minnow internationally, Australia played a quite significant role in the formulation of the Universal Declaration. And Article 14 of the Universal Declaration says that all human beings have the right to seek asylum in any country they can reach. So we we were there and we were waving the flag and supporting the idea. We seem to have backed away from it just a bit.
Do you think, like, if that were taught in schools as one of our great historic moments, much like the story of Ned Kelly, much like the story of the Eureka Stockade, that is a massive example of Australia punching above its weight. Normally, it's only gold medals at the Olympics is the only place we punch above our weight. But if kids were taught that in schools and they understood that that was a moment of pride for our country, then we might only have to wait 18 years before we make a difference.
That's right. And then you've got to persuade kids who are 18 or older to actually register to vote.
There's over, is it over a million 18-year-olds that haven't registered?
It's a big number anyway, enough to make a big difference on the 2nd of July.
They've liked the election. They've definitely done that.
So is when we're talking about the kind of, I don't know, the kind of juxtaposition between what we all know should be the Australia that we like. It took a generation really from Doc Evatt to liking the election. Not a generation, but
2 generations.
You know, 2.
It's 70 years ago.
Yeah. So is it that it needs to be then media or just a kind of where does the change need to come from? Is it that because you can't put it in schools if the Herald
Don't get me
Sun,
wrong, there'd be lots of talk back if you
you
did.
know, that's what I mean.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So do you think that's ever going to come around, or do you think that the superheroes who are fighting the legal battles in the courts are actually, and this is what's been happening over the last sort of 5 to 10 years, moving ahead of the legislature? Because quite often you'll be watching the news and there'll be people in Parliament changing the laws and redrawing the boundaries and all that sort of thing, and then there'll be the High Court decides, well, actually you can't do that.
Yeah, but the problem is that there aren't many constitutional constraints that the High Court can fasten on.
Yeah.
And if the courts make a decision that the Parliament doesn't like, then the Parliament changes the law to plug the gap.
Right.
So that the case ends up helping maybe a few people, but no one after that. But, you know, if we're talking about ridiculous laws, bear in mind the framework of our refugee laws. First of all, the government calls them illegal when they haven't broken the law. In fact, Article 14 of the Universal Declaration says you're allowed to do what you're doing. And then it says, well, okay, if you come to Australia and you haven't got a visa, you've got to be detained until you get a visa or until you're removed from Australia. And in one case, which Claire O'Connor argued in the High Court, it was a guy who couldn't be removed because he's stateless and he'd been refused a visa. And the Commonwealth of Australia, your government, argued all the way to the High Court that that man, innocent of any offence, could stay in detention for the rest of his life, which is horrifying when you think about it. And by a majority of 4-3, the High Court said, well, that's what the statute says, and with that meaning it's constitutionally valid. We're going to have another run at that one. The next thing it says is, you know, you can be sent for offshore processing. And one of the fascinating bits of that, which I dug out today, it starts with the section 198, capital A, reason for the subdivision. This subdivision is enacted because the Parliament considers that people smuggling and its undesirable consequences, including the resulting loss of life at sea, are major regional problems that need to be addressed. Now, stop right there. I mean, is a person safer if they run the risk of drowning than if they stay at home and face down the Taliban? You know, why not look at the undesirable risks of being killed by persecutors? Because that's basically what asylum seeking is about. And then it goes on to say, well, you can be bounced off to any country that we manage to bribe. And it then says, okay, if you've got a health problem there, you can be brought to Australia for treatment, and you are then called a transitory person. And if a transitory person happens to be a pregnant woman who has the child in Australia, it is defined as a transitory child. And it's denied any citizenship or right of citizenship in Australia, and a transitory child can be moved to an offshore detention centre because they're a transitory child. Now,
so
that's
logically, but looking at how ridiculous that law is and playing it out, the two examples that you gave, does that then mean that that child could be born into a situation where it is indefinitely detained because it is a stateless transitory child?
Yes.
So the only crime committed by the child was being born, and therefore
That's original sin.
Could spend the rest of its life in detention.
It could. Except that we know that Nauru doesn't want people for longer than a few years. If the child had been born in Nauru, it would have been a Nauruan citizen, and that's why Nauru says, take him away, have the child in Australia, because Nauru's got a land area of 21 square kilometres. It would fit a dozen times into the CBD.
It's retrofitting. All these things are retrofitting these sort of these laws to fictional. Like they're making them into fictions. It's not true that child wasn't born on land that is Australian land. Therefore, most Australians would probably think that's an Australian child. So you kind of, it's the ultimate arrogance, isn't it, to say, well, the law is a completely made up kind of Alice in Wonderland style, crazy thing, just because we can get away with it. What does that mean for? Is there any consideration of the practical of that child's actual life, do you think, by the people that make these laws, or do you think it's all politics?
No, it's all politics. I mean, I don't think that classifying a child born in Australia as a transitory child who can be sent offshore for however long is actually going to save anyone from drowning.
No. You wouldn't have thought
it
so.
Doesn't work.
No.
It's ridiculous. But it is the end point of a policy which began with populism and a bit of luck and has built on that. One fact which most people don't remember, I mean, everyone remembers the Tampa episode in 2001, and what is interesting is that the first judgment in the Tampa litigation was handed down in Melbourne at 2:15 in the afternoon on the 11th of September 2001. 10 hours later, there's the attack on America, and all of a sudden the world looks different, and all of a sudden John Howard can, say, well, all terrorists are Muslim and all boat people are Muslim and they're illegal, and it's been relentless since then, since September 2001.
So you mentioned homeless laws that affect homeless people, kind of target them, or at least have an impact on them that is inequitable. What can you describe that to us? Because probably most of us don't know what they are.
Begging for alms is a criminal offence. You can go to jail because you're homeless. You can go to jail because you just need some money to buy some food. That's ridiculous. That is really ridiculous, because it sees begging as a criminal offence instead of a reflection of a social problem. And once you do that, then you really realise that the legislation stays like that because the parliamentarians don't care and beggars probably don't vote, and it's the problem with human rights in Australia. Most people's human rights in Australia are never under threat. At the margins...
except for this political correctness, which is ruining everything.
Well, there is that.
Can't say what you want anymore, Julian. But that strikes me as the causes of homelessness, so often mental illness, financial hardship. There's a long list of reasons why people are homeless. All of them are social problems, social or health problems. But all of those problems are very difficult to solve. And politicians are terrible at problems that are very difficult to solve. Yeah,
but you don't even get anywhere near solving it by throwing the people in jail. All you do is hide it and maybe compound it, but you don't solve it. But you're right. I mean, political overreach is crazy. Remember, a few years ago now, there was a law passed in Victoria which made it, said that any teacher who had any conviction for any sex offence could no longer be a teacher. And it was really rock solid. And there was a teacher in Orbost who'd been teaching in the Orbost school for, 25 years or something, and it turned out that he had a conviction when he was 18 years old for a sex offence, namely having sex with a girl who was just short of 16 years old. He later married her. They were still married. He was a very popular teacher at the school, and he was sacked because he had that offence on his record. I mean, really, it's crazy.
And that's the thing. The enforcement of laws like this do so much more damage than the situations that they're designed to remedy in any way whatsoever. Prosecuting a homeless person for begging on the street only compounds the problem that person faces, only takes police resources away from other more serious issues that need solving. And
victimising women who are the victims of domestic violence. So, for example, there was an article in the Saturday paper just a couple of weeks ago, true story, and I know it because I know the person involved. She had been frequently beaten up by her husband, and she is liable for the damage done to the house by him. You know, she can't get out of the bond of the house because he knocked her about. And I know Justice Connect have dealt with a case where a woman was liable to the landlord because she's a co-tenant with the husband, liable to the landlord because of damage to the carpet. He had killed the family pet and that stained the carpet. And she's liable for it. Now, how mad's that?
Completely insane. We are about to take questions, so everybody get yourselves, gird your loins.
Think of all the ridiculous things that have happened to you when you came in touch with the law. No, don't.
No.
A bit too depressing.
So situations like that, which if you raised... I mean, this is a gruelling election campaign that we are in, and there's every chance for anyone to spring an awkward conversation on a politician on any given day. If you confronted a politician with that scenario in front of a camera, it would be impossible to argue that that's a sensible
Yeah, it's
law.
state legislation though, so in a federal campaign you probably wouldn't get a legitimate chance to do that.
Do you think that people, though, think... I think if you asked every Australian, do you believe in human rights, they'd say yes, and they'd imagine a prison overseas and, you know, bars on it and, whatever. But they don't imagine trans rights, do they? They don't... because you see the thing in the past. They probably see Doc Everett and you know, in the past as... they were protecting really solid... principles.
And they say that because they went to one of those rare schools that actually taught about it.
Yeah, well, that's right, exactly. But change freaks people out, and, you know, the newspapers help them to freak out. So if there's something kind of that's just on the edge, that's where the problem kind of it presents itself, isn't it?
Yeah, it is vulnerable people at the margins who generally are the subject of laws that are ridiculous or unfair in their effect. And that's why, I mean, the thing about, you know, do we think human rights are important? I agree with you. I think most Australians do. But then we tolerated the fact that David Hicks and Mamdouh Habib were held without charge by our allies in Guantanamo Bay for years before anyone started complaining about it. We knew for generations that we'd taken Aboriginal children from their parents, didn't seem too troubled by that. We've known for a long time now that asylum seekers are treated in the way that we're all familiar with, and by and large, most Australians seem to support the government's approach. So in what sense do we believe human rights are important? Maybe we just think our human rights are important.
Right. Who's got a question after that?
Welcome to my world.
It's extraordinary. Yeah, I can see some questions, but I also see here we go. Yep.
How are you doing? Thanks for a great night. I'm walking out of here with a little less hope than when I walked in, and so I'd like to go back to something that you said earlier about being hopeful, and I'm just wondering where your hope derives from. Thanks.
My hope derives from a very simple position that I came to in 2 steps. First was, Kate and I were at a very fancy social function in, I think, 2003, And the wife of a very senior, highly respected colleague sidled up to me and said, "Oh, do you think it appropriate that a member of the bar should speak publicly about these matters?" And it really cut, because there is a tradition at the bar that you don't speak publicly about stuff. And so without the benefit of preparation, I said to her, "Well, do you think it appropriate to know about these things and remain silent?" And that had two really useful consequences. The first was that it helped me explain to myself why it was that I felt impelled to keep speaking. And second, she never spoke to me again.
Not a great loss.
The second step was the realisation that although as a barrister in my day job I'm very results oriented, with this one I'm not at all sure that I can, get us to where we need to be. But at least with my last breath on this planet, I'll be able to say, I'm glad I did something, rather than I wish I had tried. That keeps you going.
Another question?
Do you think that if there were a constitutional court in the country, that would be a better protection for human rights?
If we had a different constitution, it would. But our constitution does not protect many fundamental rights at all. It protects the right of free political speech, and that was only found by the High Court in the Longy case by interpolation, from the sort of nature of the thing. And the other is freedom of religion. But apart from that, there are no constitutional guarantees of what you would think of as human rights at all. And Kevin Rudd, to his eternal disgrace, you remember, he had that inquiry that Frank Brennan ran about whether we should have a statutory, not a constitution, but a statutory Bill of Rights. And Frank, against his initial instinct, came down with a report which said, yes, we should have a statutory Bill of Rights. And Kevin Rudd suddenly said, well, we're not going to have one. And a constitutional Bill of Rights, you know what it's like trying to change the Constitution. Try and get a constitutional Bill of Rights, and George Pell will be barking and saying how terrible it would be. So no, a constitutional court. The High Court is a constitutional court, and it really doesn't have a great deal to work with, which is ridiculous.
Thank you for a very enlightening evening. Just one...
Maybe not as hilarious as you expected.
Just how some people can get trapped by the law because of just sheer time of a few hours. Of a case recently which was reported in The Age by the inevitable John Sylvester, where a young couple of teenagers had been together for quite a while, and on his 18th birthday they happened to go upstairs and jumped into bed and were not doing anything, but they were naked, and got sprung by the young girl who was a minor, and they then took him to report it to the police, so he got charged with having sex with a minor, even though they didn't. And if it happened 2.5 hours before, he would not have had a black mark against him. And how crazy is that?
Well, it's not my position to comment on particular examples. But to some extent, I'm no expert, but that's the absurdity of life. It's a quirk of fate that anyone is born in a country that is a war zone as opposed to a peaceful country. That's the random chance of life on this planet, and that is, to my understanding, why the law can serve a role in making sense of that absurdity. And it's how we actually hold together as a society, how we function and move ahead and improve. And talking about hope, as we were before, I think it's better now than it was 50 years ago. That gives me hope. Taking, for example, what's happening in North Carolina at the moment with the ridiculous transphobic bathroom laws that are being passed, and the fact that there's been a political disaster for the man behind it. It's been a financial disaster for North Carolina, and it's made an entire country talk about what it is to be trans. And what it is to be trans is not a guy in a frock. It's about who you are as a person.
Yeah.
And that conversation, there's no way that would have been happening 10 years ago, let alone 50 years ago. And it may have been happening in very limited circles. And so I get some hope from the fact that I think we are making more sense of the world as we go on. And in certain areas we're making great strides. But there are the areas, I mean, refugee issues stand out, where we seem to be going backwards. The way we were in the 70s made more sense than the way we are in 2016. I feel with domestic violence that progress will be made because I think we now finally have a national consciousness of it as an issue, and that has happened only very recently. But with regards to that particular example, I don't know enough about it to have a firm opinion, but what I will say is but for a few hours here and there, my life would have been pretty different along the way too.
I agree with everything Charlie said. I would just add one thing. Whenever you're making laws of that general sort, you have to draw a line somewhere. And inevitably there will be cases that fall so close to the line that it seems unreasonable. But that's, I wouldn't blame the parliamentarians for that. 18 seems like a sensible cut-off, and maybe isn't he unfortunate that he didn't have a watch that was less reliable?
I once sat on this stage with now Justice Debbie Mortimer, who was talking about the fact about that question of asylum seekers and why because actually the polls used to indicate that Australians supported asylum seekers coming to Australia, and then that's been reversed, which is interesting and I think implicates the media considerably. And what she said was that she had seen what had happened in, I think it was Christmas Island, when a boat crashed. When the boat crashed, people were dying and drowning, and the locals, there was a considerable, I may be characterising slightly what she said, but there was a bit of tension between the locals and the concept of asylum seekers generally. But when they saw them in the sea, they leapt in and they got the humans out of the water. And she said, and that's the thing, and that's why there are laws where we're not allowed to hear from doctors, we're not allowed to hear from lawyers, we're not allowed to hear from people who know what's actually going on. And also, we're not allowed to see photographs and so on because we're not actually being exposed to them. So maybe we need to just expose it.
Actually, that is an interesting example of a ridiculous law. The Australian Border Force Act, which came into force last July, it makes it, apart from anything else, it makes it a criminal offence for anyone who works in the detention system to disclose any fact that they've learned in their capacity as working in the detention system. So doctors, for example, in civil society, if a doctor becomes aware of a case of child abuse, it's a criminal offence if they don't report it. But if they become aware of a case of child abuse in the detention system, it's a criminal offence if they do report it. Now, that's, on the face of it, a pretty stupid law. But then the parliamentarians let themselves down even further by including in section 48 a defence. And the defence is that it's not an offence to make the disclosure if the disclosure was made fair dinkum for the purpose of reducing a serious threat to the life or health of a person. So that means that if they prosecute David Isaacs, who has really been heroic in this, paediatrician who's spent time on Nauru and has written widely and spoken in the media about what's going on, if they prosecute him, his defence would involve going into the witness box and telling all the details of what he saw in Nauru to demonstrate the problem which led him to make the disclosure that he's been prosecuted for. And I think the government has worked out that prosecuting him might be a retrograde step. Coupled with the fact that I publicly offered for anyone who's prosecuted under Section 42, I promised to put together the best pro bono defence ever seen in this country, and we'll have lawyers falling over themselves to be part of it, and Justice Connect, I'm sure, will be leading the pack. But it's, how insane is that? They actually, I don't think they noticed. I think they thought the whistleblower
would scare enough people.
Legislation would operate, and it's so weak, it doesn't matter.
Right.
But Section 48 has really caused Section 42 to be pretty useless.
They've tied themselves deliciously in knots.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Except, of course, it has a chilling effect, which is very important, because rational people don't want to be a defendant at all. I mean, being a successful defendant, fine, but they just don't want to be a defendant.
No.
So the fact that they can beat it is only cold comfort.
Yes. Any more questions? Yes, there are a few. Where are our roving people? Got one over there.
Hi there, guys. Charlie, love your show. Lorin, thanks for tonight. And Julian, I've always wanted to ask this question of you. If you and we in this room, majority probably, had our way and we had a civil, compassionate, generous law with regard to asylum seekers, what would actually happen? Would the oceans flood with people? And is this the... we don't talk about what would actually happen. I'd love to know your thoughts.
I don't think it would, because people setting out in an attempt to reach safety know that it's a dangerous trip. And the largest arrival rate of uninvited boat people ever in our history, well, at least since 1788, it was 25,000 to 24,000 in 1 year. Now, that's not a big number for a country with, 150 to 200,000 new permanent migrants every year. It's not a big number. We get... They used to talk about failures of border control, which is ridiculous, because, we get about between 4 and 5 million people arriving in the country every year, mostly for tourism or business. And in one peak year, we get 25,000 who come here without permission. Well, that's a failure rate of 0.5%. Now, if ever I got 99.5% for an exam at school, which I didn't, I would have thought that wasn't a failure. That was pretty good, But they called it a failure of border control because it failed in 0.5% of cases. That's ridiculous. So what would it look like? I don't think you would ever get numbers that were much different to that. And I think we could cope without any difficulty at all. And we could all be glad that the country is living up to its ideals of itself. At the moment, we are betraying the way we actually think of ourselves. What do we think of ourselves? Land of the fair go, give everyone an equal chance, be decent to people, all of that.
It seems the more we breach that, the more we insist upon it as well,
Because we've been told they're illegal. We think we're being protected from criminals, which is a lie. And the chief liars, by the way, are Peter Dutton and Scott Morrison. Let them sue me if they wish.
You don't mind being a defendant, Julian?
I don't mind being a defendant. I would welcome a libel suit by Peter Dutton or Scott Morrison when I call them liars for referring to boat people as illegal, because it will bring the issue to a head in a court, and I've also got the constitutional defence of the right of free political speech.
Something you've thought a little bit about. Do we have one more question?
Thank you. Julian, a question for you again. Can you comment on the limitations of the law where we have a ridiculous situation where we've legislated for equal pay for women, but we have an expanding gender pay gap?
I agree it's ridiculous. I don't know how you solve it. We pride ourselves in this country of having created laws which are supposed to guarantee equality of the sexes. So much so that there was a bit of concern in the public when the first Abbott cabinet had only Julie Bishop as the only woman in it. But would the reaction have been the same in the public if the first Gillard government had had only one man in the cabinet? I don't think so. I think the place would have been in uproar. We pay lip service to the idea of the equality of the sexes, but we really aren't fair dinkum about it. And that's a great pity. It'll take a while before we are. And when women genuinely get paid an equal amount for equal work, then maybe we'll think we've got there. When women are more or less equally represented in Parliament, as they are in some European countries, then you can say we're getting somewhere. But these are the little bits where you see how ridiculous laws happen. Because when there is a difference between your stated objectives and your real objectives, or your stated ideals and your real ideals, that's when you get ridiculous laws. And usually to the detriment of people who are vulnerable or marginal. Women are vulnerable, homeless people, people victims of domestic violence, they're vulnerable. And the parliamentarians don't care.
We, around our writers' room at the Weekly, mooted a ludicrous solution to the issue that women were paid between 17 and 20% less than men across the board consistently. The needle hasn't moved over the last few years, no matter how much we talk about it, no matter how much we try and solve the problem with discussion. So the best idea we came up with was a national campaign called Take Friday Off. If women are paid 20% less than men, then they should work 20% less. That sounds completely fair to me. So I don't know how many weeks you'd have to do it to have all the women of the world take Friday off. I mean, it would grind to a halt in 5 minutes. The world would stop because of that. I don't know how many Fridays it would take before everyone started to take it pretty seriously and come up with some practical solutions.
All the boys going out for lunch on Fridays and find that there's no one there serving them.
Excellent. Well, look, I think that's a wonderful place to leave it, an actual practical solution.
You should run,
that's
you
my
should run for
specialty.
Parliament.
Absolutely.
It is your... thank you very much to everybody tonight. Can we give a massive big thank you to these people up here tonight?
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.